All right, quickly introduction about some of my lab members. About 50% of them are contributing to some of the research that I'm going to talk about here. And our main interest is focused on developing some of the nanotubes and nanowires materials, as well as preparing some new materials and new nanostructures for device fabrications for various areas, including electronic, magnetic, sensing, and photonics. So what I'm going to do today is to look at the motivation about the transistor or electronics that will be applicable for computing in the future. As you already know that Intel is currently running or producing transistor of 65 nanometer feature size and will be further shorter by this year. And you can see also the oxide layer that will be used in these kind of devices is atomic layers. So it will be very quickly coming to the so-called bottleneck. But so far what we have been doing is that we have already transforming the computer that can fill up the whole room into a single piece of chips, hopefully sometime by this year. But what can we proceed further from here? And this is a summary of the whole picture of the so-called processor or the so-called transistor. This is a FET with the source drain here. And the important component here is the channel, which is the semiconducting channel. And in this case, in fact, you can continue to use the silicon top-down approach to create your devices, or you're trying to use the nanowires bottom-up approach to make your semiconducting channel here, or you wanted to use the carbon nanotubes or etc., or all the way going down to the one-dimensional structures using the molecule, which Professor Pandey already reviewed, or you might want to look at the SET, which Paul will talk about next, or some of the spintronic approach. And very clear, you can see from here, all these processes will depend on what kind of materials that you can be used for your devices. So I would like to say that the whole topic itself is too big to be covered simply by 40 minutes talks, and actually maybe 30 minutes. With consideration on semiconducting, conductor, insulator, magnetic, spintronic, multifunctional materials, etc. So what I would like to focus is just give you some quick review on what has been done on carbon nanotubes, another types of nanotubes called boron nitride nanotubes, and zinc oxide nanostructures, and we will quickly go back to silicon and see, should we continue with silicon? All right, this is what we are going to do then. The contents of my talk will be divided to 4 sections. So after each section, I might give you a few minutes for questions so that you don't have to hold your question all the way down. All right, first of all, let's talk about carbon nanotubes. Some of you are already familiar that you start considering a piece of hexagonal network of carbon. It's just like a piece of paper. It's just that you have many, many carbon at the junction here. Each carbon will stay at one corner here. And you can see you fold this graphene sheet so that edges here, you fit into these edges here, you will form a seamless cylinder. So in this case, you call this a zigzag carbon nanotubes. Or you might want to fit these edges, which is in a zigzag shape, to match this edge by folding it downward. Then you can form this kind of nanotubes called armchair nanotubes. And some of you already know that these tubes, nanotubes, will always be metallic. It will conduct electrons just like a piece of graphite. And if you can fold them in other direction, you can form the so-called chiral nanotubes. They can be semiconducting or metallic as well. And the whole picture here is just to tell you that all the carbon nanotubes that you make all of them might behave very differently. So this is the very main challenge of carbon nanotubes. And if you have more than one shell of the graphene, for instance, this one have 2 shells, we call it double wall nanotubes, or you have more, 5, 7, and etc., we call the whole class of the materials multi-wall nanotubes. Well, this has been the first field effect transistor ever made in the world, and which is using a piece of carbon nanotubes, single wall nanotubes, laying across 2 electrodes. And the whole cross-section structure is shown here. Basically, it will form a transistor with source, drain, and the gate electrode. And you can see the switching is pretty nice. What has been progressed further from here is that in year 2001, you start to see the carbon nanotubes. You found that they always behave like p-types. And in fact, this is basically because of the adsorption of the oxygen molecule. And from here, this paper already defined how to form the so-called inverter, a logic circuit, based on the p-type nanotubes. Or alternatively, you can dope by evaporate some sodium vapor on the nanotubes. You can convert the p-types to the n-types nanotubes. And in this case, if you can combine both the p and n types together, you basically can form the complementary logic circuit as shown here. And actually, a few months later, a paper in Science already progressed much further from the idea that I showed you just now. In this case, it is using a local gate. The so-called local gate means each conduction channel here, it will has its own gate electrode. You can see here that you have an aluminum line, and each of these aluminum lines will have a very thin layer of about 2 nanometers thick of the native oxide. They will enable the switching of the gate of your transistor. And you will have a piece of carbon nanotubes laying across these 2 electrodes, which is source and drain here. So in this case, on one piece of the chip, you can have multi nanotubes because all of them are having their own gate. So if you do so, you can form, by using one piece of the conduction channel, the inverter, you can use 2 pieces of them to form some of the logic gate or the memory device, and for the oscillator as well. So what I would like to say is that many advancements already obtained by using single wall carbon nanotubes, right? And most of these tubes up to year 2002 was grown by laser ablation, arc discharge, or some of the CVD, but they are in the powder form, which means all the tubes are grown randomly, right? You cannot organize them, and they are contaminated by all kinds of contamination. In order for some of the devices that I show you to be constructed, you have to use some of these random tubes and disperse them on the substrate by suspension, and then put it inside the electron microscope and find the tubes, and then lay down your electrode one by one, which you might spend a few days to make just one device. Or you can be using the AFM to align your tubes to the position that you want, which is very time consuming. So what I would like to say is that to enhance the circuit constructions in the future, some of these challenges must be overcome. For instance, you have to be able to achieve low temperature, clean, and organized synthesis of some of these single wall nanotubes, as well as the multi-wall tubes, because devices, you might need some conducting wire to bring your electron from one point to another. And carbon nanotubes, multi-wall tubes is just the right materials for this purpose. And you will need to be able to deposit carbon nanotubes across a pair of desired electrodes. For instance, within the chips, you might have 1 million pieces of the electrode. You want each pair of the electrode to have only 1 nanotubes aligned across them. And also, you have to be able to sort single wall carbon nanotubes to semiconductor tubes or metallic tubes, so that you can only choose the semiconducting tubes for your applications. And etc. The list will be very long. Quickly go to some of the results they obtained in the field. This is a paper come out in year 2004 in Science, and talking about low temperature and organized growth of clean single wall nanotubes. This is a chips, and you can see that the tubes are vertically aligned. Don't mislead that this is not orange. This is just a matches. So basically, the tubes can be grows up to a few millimeters in height. And you can see, if you zoom in here, the tubes looks like this. Whole bundle of the tubes are actually clumped together and become a pillar, right? And this is very important work in the sense that they're using the water to clean up the catalyst and clean up some of the amorphous carbon so that the tube is nice, clean, and pure. However, if you think carefully, if you're using water to clean the amorphous, which means you will have the chances that you will oxidize your carbon nanotubes at the same time. So you will create defects in your tubes. So this is very exciting work, but it's not the best. So what we have been doing in Michigan Tech here is that we spend some efforts to grow nanotubes by two techniques. One is the plasma-enhanced chemical vapor deposition, and another one is the so-called thermochemical vapor deposition. Let me quickly go through some of the work on plasma CVD. And actually, this is the only way you can make vertically aligned tubes with controllable location and density. For instance, you can see here, if you have 5 spots of the so-called catalyst particle here, you can make 5 pieces of the nanotubes vertically aligned, or 2 of them, or just 1 of them. These are the work that have been demonstrated by some others' colleagues. But however, if you look carefully, the tube structure itself doesn't look like a very high-order graphite structures. So which means if you want to let the electron flowing through these structures, your electron will experience a lot of resistance and generate a lot of heat, which you don't want. So the first thing to make this nicely is to make this tube in a higher quality. This is what we have done by using this technique. Let me quickly show you how actually the whole process will go. So basically, you start with a catalyst on a substrate. Come out very soon. So this catalyst is the so-called nickel, and when you heat up the substrate, part of the catalyst will start to melt, and you use the plasma to generate a growth species to shower down, and this carbon species will dissolve inside the catalyst. And when this catalyst becomes saturated, the carbon nanotube will start to segregate out from the catalyst and form vertically aligned carbon nanotubes, as shown here. A very quick cartoon. And if you do so, you can form all kinds of the tubes. And eventually we found that we can always reproduce some of the fiber that already achieved by many others. But at the same time, you can produce very high quality tubes that have never been demonstrated by others. And you can see here, these tubes are very straight, vertically aligned. And you can see a very bright spot at the tips of the tubes. That is the catalyst particle on the left. So let me move on to grow nanotubes by another technique. And I should skip some of the details here, but I just wanted to tell you that we have understand the fundamental mechanism behind the growth of these tubes, which can be shown by this animation. So what basically we have done is that we use a molecule C2H2 called acetylene for the growth. And again, we put a substrate and put a catalyst particle, which is iron in this case. And when you have the C2H2 molecule start to land on the surface, a charge transfer from a molecule to the catalyst will help them to decompose very fast. And all this carbon will start to absorb or dissolve inside the catalyst and start to form the carbon nanotubes. So by understanding some of this technique, we are already able to control the so-called density of the tube. So what is important for the most effective growth is that you have to make sure that all the catalysts, it might be 1 trillion pieces of the catalyst at this size on the chips. You have to make sure that all of them will be effectively grows so that when they try to move randomly to various directions, they will knock with each other by van der Waals force. And in that case, since all of them, around every nanotube, there are many tubes that will try to knock on him. So the only way that he can escape is going up, right? He don't want to go left, right, or front or back. Otherwise, he will knock with another nanotube. So Since they wanted to escape to the top, in that case, you will make high density of tubes, looks like this. You can see that all the tubes are vertically aligned from the substrate. And each fine structure that you see, 100 or 1,000 of nanotubes inside. And this is the multi-wall tubes. And you can form the New York City if you want with all the nice blocks of the building. And not only using the multi-wall, based on the same theory, you can make only 2 walls, what we call double wall tubes. And of course, you can make single wall tubes. And you can see that all these can be grown, and the density here is much higher than the work that I showed you that achieved by water vapor. And in this case, there's no water here, which means the tube should be less damaging. Okay? All right. So about the growth can be done. What about placing the tubes across a pair of electrodes that you want? So I skipped some of the details because it is still unpublished. We can control the density of tubes that align across 2 electrodes here by the dielectrophoresis. And you can imagine that if we apply this same technique to this microelectrode, we will have only 1 nanotubes across a pair of electrodes. And this will be done maybe next week in my lab. And actually, we already tested here by using a very sharp AFM tips, which is at the tips here will be about 15 nanometer in diameter. And you can see that one piece of the tubes will be aligned on the tips. All right, I talk about the growth, talk about how to handle the tubes, make them align across a pair of electrodes. The next thing is how to sort your single wall nanotubes. And this is a very new work. Year 2006, last year in Nature Nanotech, reported by Northwestern. So they can use some surfactants so that the surfactants will absorb on carbon nanotubes with different diameter. And you can see small diameter we have less molecule, and bigger diameter we have bigger or more or denser molecule absorbed on it. So in this case, you will create nanotubes condensate at different density if you do the centrifugal process, right? This is a very interesting work going on. So just quickly summarize what I have talked to you about carbon nanotubes. Some advancement already done. We can fabricate FET, we can fabricate IC, and low temperature, clean, organized tubes can be grown now. And you can deposit tubes across a pair of electrodes that you want. And you can sort the nanotubes to some extent. And what's remaining in the field will be how to you integrate large amount of the tubes to form your IC. And you have to design your circuit so that the operation can be done in such a large scale devices. And how will be the performance of these nanotube-based devices compared to the silicon-based devices, and etc. Right? And doping, you can see that the doping that we see is very primitive, right? So that's all I have on the carbon nanotube section. Do you have any question before I move further? All right, let's move on to the second topic on boron nitride nanotubes. Okay, these are the phases of boron nitride. All right, this is a very good neighborhood of carbon. If you're a chemist, you know that carbon is in the group 4 of your periodic table, right? And boron actually is in group 3 before carbon. Nitrogen is in group 5 after carbon. So naturally you say, okay, if I use just carbon, I can build carbon nanotubes. Can I use one boron 50% and 50% nitrogen to build nanotubes, which called boron nitride nanotubes? It's exactly as shown here. You see through along the axis of the tubes here, you can see the boron nitrogen in a hexagonal network. So what's the advantage of boron nitride nanotubes is that first, carbon nanotubes having a band gap which is smaller than silicon, which means if you have heat problem in your computer now, you will have more problem if you replace silicon by carbon nanotubes, right? The band gap smaller, it will be noisy to operate your system. So boron nitride nanotubes has large band gap. And the important thing is that it's insensitive to the change of the tube's diameter or number of walls or how the tubes fold become a nanotubes. So which means out of 1 million or 1 trillion pieces of boron nitride tubes that you produce, all of them will almost behave the same. So you don't have to sort the boron nitride nanotubes for your devices. The next thing is that you can also tune the band gap even down to 0 by so-called giant stack effect by applying a transverse electric field. And it is multifunctional. It can be used for optoelectronics, of course electronics, and they have some piezoelectricity properties. And they can be very stable to oxidation. So if you have a computer chip that operate in very high density, you might have a few hundred degrees Celsius of temperature maybe, but this one can be stable up to even more than 1,000 Celsius. So I would say that boron nitride nanotubes will complement the uses of carbon nanotubes. All right, actually the device or FET, field effect transistor, by using boron nitride nanotubes already demonstrated by the IBM groups back to year 2003. And some of the several advantages here is that boron nitride nanotubes are always semiconducting. They can be doped by boron or nitride. So you don't have to find the dopant for boron nitride nanotubes. You just take some of the boron away or take some of the nitrogen away. Then you can form P and N types. And they have a large band gap, which means they allow a good off state. So you don't want a noisy nano electronic devices if you don't want them to turn on, and etc. All right? However, the bad news is that such a good materials, however, it is very difficult to grow. You have to use temperature higher than 1,000 or 1,200 degrees Celsius or even higher here. And all these materials are in a powder form dominated by impurity. More than 70% of your product will have to go away. It's not boron nitride nanotubes. So this is not what we want. What we're interested is try to grow it directly on the substrate, low temperature, right? Otherwise, your silicon chips will melt at 1,500 degrees Celsius. Minimum impurity, if possible, impurity-free. A line grows, you want them to grow organized. All right, this is how we have achieved at Michigan Tech here by using the so-called reactive laser, pulse laser deposition. So you just focus a pulse of laser on a piece of hexagonal phase boron nitride target here. In that case, you will generate a vapor of boron and nitrogen from the laser ablation. And on the substrate here, you apply a radio frequency plasma so that you can create a negative bias voltage on the substrate, right? So that all your boron and nitrogen ions will bombard on the substrate in a kinetic energy that you can control by your bias voltage. So if you do so, we found that there is a regime. If you apply your bias voltage too high, all the atoms that reach to the substrate will bounce away, sputtering. All right? So this regime we call total film resputtering regime, which means if you put a chip on substrate, apply very high bias voltage, after 10 hours you take your chips out, you find that nothing has been grown on chips. Everything deposited will bounce away. We found that we can grow these boron nitride tubes at this no growth region. So we just have to put some nano catalyst, and the plume that strike on the surface will bounce away, except those stick on the catalyst. If they stick on the catalyst, they will dissolve the catalyst and capture them inside, and then they will segregate out to form the boron nitride tubes. And you can see that the clean bundle of the tubes, like this, are vertically aligned on the substrate. This one is bigger diameter. You can see individual of the boron nitride tubes vertically aligned on the substrate. Quickly, you can see the fine structures of the long-range order of the graphitic shell, and you can see that there's no catalyst on the substrate. You can go back here, there's no catalyst. It's perfectly clean. And you can pattern them to grow at the spot that you want. And just for the characterization, and we prove that the band gap is about 4.4 to 4.9 electron volts, pretty stable for most of the tubes. Let me skip this one. As I told you, if you apply low bias voltage, you will create boron nitride films. If you apply high enough of bias voltage, you have very thin films. If this is too high, most of the atoms will just bounce back, except those absorbed inside the catalyst here, which will allow the growth of the tubes. All right, quickly summarize what you have in boron nitride tubes. It's a wide band gap. You can have very well-defined on-off stage, less noisy device that can be done. Almost uniform band gap, so you don't have to sort the tubes that you make. Just use them, all right? They can achieve ohmic contact if you change your electrode to match the work function to the band gap, all right? But the challenges here is that how is the same for the carbon nanotubes on the design and large-scale synthesis, and how will be the performance as compared to carbon nanotubes or even silicon? It's a big question. And you would like boron nitride nanotubes to grow in a quantity, maybe at least as much as carbon nanotubes. And doping is one thing that has to be done in the future. All right, I'm done on carbon nanotubes, boron nitride tubes, before I move on to zinc oxide. All right, what is interesting about zinc oxide? It has pretty big band gap, larger than silicon and carbon nanotubes. So it will be a very stable and less noisy material to use. And also it can be function as the optoelectronic materials or plasmonic devices. And also very important is that it can appear in many different types of structures. And they have multiple functions as well for optical, electronic, optoelectronic, photochemical, and piezoelectric devices. So out of one device that you build, you might be able to use the same device for different functions. So that is a plus of these materials. And some of the work that we have done, you can see that zinc oxide can appear in a belt shape. Not the belt like this, but this is 1 micrometer in width, and the thickness will be a few tenths of nanometer. And you can see that sometimes you can grow the nano propeller here. So next time, if you wanted to make a nano helicopter, let me know. Or the fan here, you can use this one. All right, you can make them in a comb shape, right? Like this, right? I don't know what we can use for yet. Let me know if you have a good idea. Or maybe until you have a nano man or nano toy or whatever, you need to comb his or her hair, let me know. I can borrow you one. All right, you can see that zinc oxide is very good crystal. You can see a very nice hexagonal shape belong to the so-called acidic structures. So they are very high crystal quality, very easy to grow. And you can see that we can even make them in a sword, you know. So if you have a nano sword man, let me know. All right, of course, this is one of the most popular materials, which is called the nano wire. And the challenges is that, can you grow nano wires 100% without the mixture of nano sword, nano rod, nano comb, or nano belt? So actually, we have just done that, and hopefully we publish very soon. So if you have the nano wire here, it will be very interesting for you to use it to replace carbon nanotubes or boron nitride nanotubes, because they can be grown very easily. This one is grown at 500 degrees Celsius. Absolutely compatible to the CMOS technology. You can directly grow them across the electrode if you want. All right, just skip some of them, and actually already demonstrated in year 2003 using a piece of nano belt, which demonstrated the on-off state. And also, it can be used to sense UV light, actually. And you can see that if the light turns off on here, you can generate the so-called photoelectric or photoelectron inside the zinc oxide materials. So device, no problem, you can use it. And more fascinating here is that you can make them grow vertically aligned like this. And you can see that if you have a substrate and you want to lay your one-dimensional materials horizontally on the substrate, you need to put electrode in this way. Even though your nanotubes or nanowire is a few tenths of nanometer in diameter, but the actual area of the device that you can make will be micrometer. So you don't want to use them. So instead of put them horizontally, you want to make them vertically. So materials that can grow vertically will have advantage, right? So for instance, if you put the one piece of the zinc oxide nanowires here, right? And you coat all of them by oxide, and then go through all the lithography technique. You put down your so-called drain and the source and the gate electrode like this, drain electrode, source electrode, which is the substrate, and the gate, the so-called surround gate or conditions. You actually can make the so-called vertical surround gate field effect transistor, right? So it's a very interesting work going on here. And you can actually see that some of the devices demonstrated on zinc oxide, they always behave N-type, because oxygen tends to have vacancies inside the zinc oxide. And it's very challenging to make these P-type materials, and it just published this year. So I'm giving you the latest information, right? So it can be done P-types and single crystal materials, and it shows the gate effect of the P-type materials. However, these types of P-type zinc oxide is still not very stable at this moment. I would like to introduce to you a new structure called zinc oxide nanotubes. Why nanotubes? They are tube structures. All the atoms, zinc oxide is confined near the surface. And it will be much more easier to manipulate the property of the tubes by just some surface effect. And it has been done also by using zinc oxide or some other nitride or oxide materials that you can be used them for nanofluidic or sensing devices. Imagine that you have one reservoir, another reservoir, and you have a nanotubes here, and you can allow your molecule to flow from one to another, and you can control the flow by applying the gate to the devices. And this can be used for biosensing, or maybe it's a new way for nanocomputing. If you allow one molecule to swim by, you have one signal come out, 1. No molecule, 0. So you don't have to consume 1 million pieces of the tube, but just one tube. You can just switch them by molecule flow. Wow, this is a very complicated process to make all these zinc oxide or nitride nanotubes. But we come up with a much better way. We look back to the theory. Let me skip some of them here. We found that if you can cool your growth conditions so that you avoid the diffusion of the growth species on the zinc oxide nanorod, which is hexagonal shape here. And at the same time, if you look at the nucleation theory, you found that if you have a perfect atomic surface like this, you have only 1, 2, 3 possibility for the atom to land on the surface. And you will see that number 1 and 2 is the preferential site for the growth. So, which means if you can cool down your growth conditions so that no growth at the center of the rod, and they will confine the growth at the edges, just like what I show here, right? If this is the case, and if the temperature is not low enough, and you will keep them to grow along this direction, then you will form a tube structures from here. And this is what we have done, and quickly you can see nice tubes here, sometimes 2 channels, sometimes 3 channels. And you will be able to see this picture in Applied Physics Letter next month. This is a cover image in Applied Physics Letter. And these are single crystalline structures, just some details of the properties. So let me quickly summarize zinc oxide. Uniform band gap, you don't have to sort them, right? Multifunctional. You can make vertical transistor. And the challenge will be large-scale synthesis and operation and the performance. Doping is still an issue, although P-types has just reported last month. All right, move to the last one, nanostructures. Any questions about zinc oxide? So let's revisit what is the possibility of silicon nanostructures. We actually already have so-called silicon nano wire, right? It's just a one-dimensional silicon structures. And it can be grown in a diameter of 10, 15 nanometer. And actually, the device already shown here, one piece of the tubes across source and drain electrode. And what has been discovered by Harvard University in year 2003 is that annealing will decrease the contact resistance between the wire and the electrodes. However, they found that they need to do surface passivation. So what is the disadvantage of wires compared to tubes is that in a wire, at the surface, you have many dangling bonds. Some atoms on the surface, they don't have a neighborhood to bond them together. So the electron will see surface roughness and defects on the surface. So you will have scattering. So this is not good for transport. So what they do is that they passivate by some kind of organic molecule, and they found that the performance can be enhanced after passivation. And what important thing discovered here is that the average trans conductance and mobility is at least comparable to the silicon IC chips nowadays, or even better. So this is very interesting. However, should we consider silicon nanotubes? Why? Nanotubes, they are perfect. There's no dangling bond on the surface, just like what I've shown you on carbon and silicon, right? So in that case, you don't have to worry about surface damages or vacancies and scattering, right? However, if you think carefully, you see graphite, nature from the earth, nature product. You have diamond, sp2, sp3 bonds from pure carbon. Silicon, you have only silicon crystal, which is diamond structures. You'll never see silicon in sp2 structures like graphite. So which means they can never form the tube structures without defects. However, there are some actually prediction, theoretical prediction. However, none of them consistent with each other. So this is very dangerous. But somehow, a lot of efforts already start working on amorphous types of tubes. They form the tubes, but these are amorphous. Year 2002 in Advanced Materials. Same thing here, they form the tubes, but it's a bamboo shape. Year 2006 in Advanced Materials. And eventually, we have a report on supercritical hydrothermal condition. They found that they can form sp2 structures, but they claim that it's a mixture of sp2 and sp3, which I don't understand, all right? Physical Review Letter, year 2005. This is our latest result. We don't have to use supercritical hydrothermal technique, vacuum technology. We can make them vertically aligned. You can see the tube is perfect, uniform in diameter. This is still ongoing. I don't want to tell you more about this one. And they are p-types, all right? And the conductivity is comparable to silicon substrate. All right, that's all I want to summarize on silicon nanostructure. Compatible to the present IC technology, doping is no problem. High mobility and conductance. They can be grow vertical configuration, right? And the remaining challenges will be the large-scale operation, surface passivation, or can we make actual silicon nanotubes? That is an open question. If not, we can roll on. This is the overall summary. Although carbon nanotubes, boron nitride tubes, zinc oxide, or silicon nanostructures has often promises, the whole field is just at the beginning stage. All right? We need many more efforts. So finally, let me acknowledge some of the funding agencies that support my work. The Department of Army, the Center for Nanophase Material Science in Oak Ridge National Lab, NSF Career Award, DARPA, ARL, and DOE. Thank you.